Thank you, Javier, for the introduction, and thank you for your very generous hospitality. It has really been, I've been here about 2.5 weeks already. It goes very fast, and I'm going to be gone, and I'm here another 2 weeks, but it's really been a delight exploring this institution and meeting some of the students, and of course Madrid itself. I apologize that I don't speak Spanish, and I was very reluctant to come because of that reason, but Javier assured me that there were enough English hearers and speakers that I could communicate with some of you, and I'm glad my English has not sent you away. Javier mentions some of my books. There are more, and one of the areas that I've gotten into, I mean, the history of science is one area, the history of medicine, that I've worked on for a long time, but I'm interested in Renaissance Jewish thought. I'm interested in English Jewish thought. I have 2 books on England. One that challenges the notion of a different Haskalah, for a different enlightenment from the Enlightenment in Germany and so on. And I've been very involved with Christian Hebraicism, converts, and all kinds of other things. And in some respects, well, Mercedes and I work on different things. We certainly read each other, and I understand that some of the things that she does I'm very interested in as well. And he mentioned the center. Reason I want to mention it once more is because it is a place that is really open for European scholars, and we have already a history of scholars from Madrid who have come and served as fellows. Beginning with Angel and Judith from Universidad Complutense, and Esperanza Alfonso, who has been there twice. She is just returning now from a second visit. Mercedes, we tried to bring for a semester, but we had her for a conference. And of course, Javier and Katya were fellows as well. So we are hoping that the next generation of young scholars from here will come, and we have a theme every year, and we invite 20 scholars. Since it is my last year as director next year, we've invited 43 scholars who are coming at various times throughout the year. So it's going to be an ongoing party. So if you're in Philadelphia next year at all, just come by and we can celebrate together. All right, so enough of that. So now I really appreciate the fact that you have come to hear me talk about such an esoteric topic. I was told that Spanish scholars aren't interested in anything other than Spain, so if I don't talk about Spain, no, I'm exaggerating. But there's nothing Spanish about my talk, and but I think it deals with some very broad themes in the early modern period, although this book, as I'm going to argue, is a modern book. But it is really part of connecting the early modern with the modern. And as you will see, it is a continuation of some of my earlier interests. Javier mentioned the book that I wrote in the 1980s, not the Farisol book, but the book called Kabbalah, Magic and Science. The narrative of a 16th century Jewish doctor, Avram Yagel. And that clearly, if you see the title of that book and the title of my lecture today, there is obviously a connection. Particularly the connection between Kabbalah and science. Kabbalah, for those of you who do not know, by the way, if my English is too fast or too furious, just put your hand up like this and slow me down. But I'm a New Yorker. I speak New York English, so, hands and, lots of emotion, and if I speak too fast, just stop me. Particularly the nexus between Kabbalah and science, between Jewish mysticism or Jewish esotericism and science. How could the two go together? What I'm doing is speaking about a book, which is right here. This is the latest edition, 1989, 1990, called Sefer ha-Brit. This is Hashalem, the complete Sefer ha-Brit. That is, the Sefer ha-Brit means the book of the covenant, but the author also defines it as a bund or an encyclopedia of the sciences. There are over 40 editions. My my great mazal is that Katya, I got interested in the Ladino versions of them. There are now, we've discovered 6 of them, 6 editions in Ladino. There are 3 Yiddish editions, and there are about 35 Hebrew editions. So this is a popular book. This is not, you can say it's esoteric, but lots of Jews read this in the modern era. There are 11 editions in Warsaw alone in the 19th century. So we're talking about a book, and as you will see, a book that is read and mentioned by everyone as a kind of vehicle, a path by which traditional Jews learn their science. But it is much more, as you will see, than a science book. And the last part of my title is called Moral Cosmopolitanism. Of all things, this is a mystical journey. And ultimately, when you reach the end of this journey, you are going to connect with what the author calls the Ruach HaKodesh, the Holy Spirit. Connecting with the Holy Spirit is not exactly prophecy, because prophets can only be in the ancient world of the Bible, of the Tanakh. But for a Jew living outside of Israel and not living in the biblical period, you can connect with the Ruach HaKodesh, you can connect with the Holy Spirit. So the ideal is essentially entering a room at the end. I mean, we have this extraordinary picture, washing your clothes, preparing for your ascent to connect with God. So this is a mystical journey in the end, although there are 400 pages about science here. So we have it all once. And the pièce de résistance, the part that I want to speak about, this is too long an introduction already, but is before you arrive at the gates of heaven, you need to be a moral and ethical human being. And one of the great demands of this particular author is that ahavat re'im, Leviticus 19, and you shall love your neighbor as yourself, ve'ahavta l'recha kamocha, shall be defined as loving all human beings. That is the non-Jew. That is the Christian. A Jew must love a non-Jew before he can enter the Holy Spirit. That is an unusual demand. And in about 50 pages of this book, there is a long discussion of a chapter called Ahavat Re'im, loving one's neighbors. And I want to talk about that. So here, what I want to do is, this is a kind of play, all right, in 4 parts. So I'm going to divide up now into 4 parts. You'll know where I am, and you'll know, thank God I'm done with the first part. I'm on to the second part, and you'll know, and we said we're going to finish in about 55 minutes at the most, but and then there'll be time for questions, and if there are no questions, we'll go to lunch. So the 4 parts are the following. I want to talk about this book in the context of early modern books that are similar. So my first part is about early modernity. I am an early modernist. That is roughly, I studied the 15th to the end of the 18th century. And then I want to talk about the book itself and describe what's in it in a little bit more detail. And then I would like to talk about that chapter about moral cosmopolitanism. How is it that a Jew, a Kabbalist, a traditional Jew, as you will see from Eastern Europe, wants us to love non-Jews, right? Jews don't do that much. Well, now, of course, a lot of Jews marry non-Jews, right? I mean, intermarriage rates are pretty high. But he's not advocating intermarriage necessarily. And then the 4th part, I want to talk about the readership. In other words, one of the aspects of this book, by the way, the reason I'm so happy is because in the last 2.5 weeks, I've basically finished the first draft of the book. The book is finished. I wrote a book on this. Not this book, my book. I'm actually going to go home now with a complete manuscript, which needs a little refining, but basically is finished. So I'm speaking about, you're getting me now at a very, very good point. But the last long chapter of the book deals with the extraordinary number of people who read this book. And I want to talk about that as well. So those are the 4 parts, okay? So follow me through, and I'm going to also show you some pictures. I'm not very good at this, but so here you're looking at the first edition, the first page. Notice there is no table of contents. The table of contents in this book is right here. You see? Can you see that? That's my handwriting. That's my table of contents. I wrote that. So there's no table of contents, and I'll explain to you why he doesn't want a table of contents. But the first page, which you can't read, most of you, is basically a description of what's in the book. And if you see on the bottom of the page, Brno. It was published in Brno in Moravia in 1797, and that was the first edition. As you will see, this is the second edition right here coming up. Vilna, 1817. The first edition and the second edition are very different. In 1801, the same publishers of the Brno edition published without the permission of the author a pirated edition. Hurwitz, well, I haven't even mentioned his name yet. The author was very upset, and he decided to publish a whole new edition to beat them in the market, which he did. So that's where we have Sefer ha-Brit ha-Shalem, the complete version, which is much longer than the first edition. All right, now let me step back. The author I'm speaking about, so this is about a book. It's a story of a book, but what I want to make an argument, it is a very important book. It's a book that helps us understand a window into the modern Jewish experience, or specifically how traditional Jews accepted, received, interacted with the larger world of science, culture, philosophy, acceptere, right?
No, cancel.
No, cancel.
Cancel.
Again.
You sure?
Yeah.
All right, okay. Thank you. So this is about tradition and modernity. So hopefully we can translate this for you into something that is larger than simply a narrative about one book. And I think you will find it interesting. All right. The name of the author is Pinhas Hurwitz. I spell it Hurwitz. He supposedly, and these dates are not exact, at least the birth date, 1765 to 1821. The 1821 is accurate because we have his gravestone in Krakow in Poland in 1821. All right? I don't have Javier writing for me, but I'll write myself now. So 1765, but that date is questionable. 1821, Hurwitz. Hurwitz was supposedly born in Vilna, so we're talking about an Eastern European Jew. But there are questions about it, because in all the histories of Vilna, with the exception of one, he's never mentioned. But his parents were apparently from Vilna. But what is interesting about him is we're speaking about a transnational Jew. This is a Jew who travels all over Europe. So we have him in Budapest, in Lemberg, in Frankfurt de Oder, in Galicia, in Amsterdam, in Rotterdam, in The Hague, in London, in Prague, and he dies in Krakow. And there's several other cities I haven't mentioned there. In other words, he makes a trek first to Berlin. I haven't mentioned Berlin, which is very critical. And then he apparently makes his way to the Netherlands. He spends at least an entire year in The Hague. It justified me spending some time in Leiden looking for him. I didn't find him, but I had a great time there. And then he went to London, which is really quite interesting, and he met a friend there, and they conversed. A friend who was also a friend of mine on my book on the Enlightenment in England, the Jewish Enlightenment, the Haskalah in England. I discovered a character named Jacob Hart, who actually wrote a very short synopsis in Hebrew of Newton, and Hurwitz goes and meets Hart. I mean, isn't it wonderful that you write one book and then all of a sudden the character in another book appears and they meet each other? I felt very good about that. And then he went back to Western Europe. I'm not sure where he went next, but he ends up in Prague trying to sell his book. Here, let me show you. I can find this quickly. Yeah. So here is the censor in Yiddish and then in German. You probably read the German better. Karl Fischer. Karl Fischer is an extraordinary figure in the history of Prague and Prague Jewish culture. He was a Christian who was the censor of Hebrew books in Prague. The book is published in 1797, the first edition. In 1799, Fisher writes this censor, which is basically an endorsement of the book. What is extraordinary is that Hurwitz claims he only knew Hebrew and Yiddish. In fact, he wrote the book originally, in Yiddish, but he claims he translated it into Hebrew. And he knew no other language, but he worked with someone who helped translate books for him that he needed for his journeys, particularly scientific works, and most of them seemed to be in German. However, I discovered, or someone discovered for me, and then I went and checked it, in the Prague archives, a letter which he wrote to Carl Fischer in German. Now, he could have had it translated, but the expert on Carl Fischer in Prague, who I just visited a couple of months ago, she has his Tagebuch, where he received the letter, he wrote a response, and he mailed it. She has all of these details, what date it was mailed on and so on, except the letter. We don't have the letter of Carl Fischer back to him. But nevertheless, Carl Fischer was a great Hebraist who corresponded with all the rabbis of Prague, and apparently liked this book because he wrote this censor, so that's another part of the story. So Prague is another area, Budapest, where he spent time. Pressburg is another critical area where he spends time and so on. There are a lot of European cities that this guy is moving around. So to call him an Eastern European Jew would be correct, but I want to argue a different kind of Jew, a Jew who is itinerant, a juif errant perhaps, a wandering Jew. But a Jew, as you will see, is not just wandering around because he's trying to find his identity, but rather a Jew who is selling books. This is a businessman. And part of what makes this book modern, I'm jumping ahead of myself now, is his understanding of the materiality of books and how to sell a book. And we'll talk about that at length. I think it's a very interesting part of the story. Besides this book, Pinhas Hurwitz is not important. He wrote a commentary, a Kabbalistic commentary on a compendium of the Lurianic Kabbalah of Emanuel Chayricki, who was an 18th century Italian Kabbalist, called Mishnat Chachamim. He wrote a commentary which was published after he died, but no one ever noticed it. It's a very interesting commentary. I tried to read through it, and my Lurianic Kabbalah is okay. Isaac Lurie, of course, was the 16th century Kabbalist in Tzfat, who developed a whole new school of Kabbalistic thought, which became extremely important. We now have a new book by Ronnie Weinstein in Israel, which talks about Kabbalah and modernity, arguing that Lurianic Kabbalah was an enormous phenomenon which rethought Jewish culture in the context of the modern world. It's a little overblown, his thesis, but nevertheless, this is a book very much influenced by the Kabbalah of Isaac Luria of the 16th century, and his commentators like Chayricki, and there are several others. One who's extremely important for the modern world is a figure named Moses Chaim Luzzatto, the Ramchal, who clearly also influenced this book. Ramchal has now come into his own. He was a Baroque writer, a Kabbalist, but he also wrote drama. He's considered to be a kind of father of modern Hebrew literature, so he walks this wonderful bridge between the religious and the secular, and all of a sudden people are discovering him in terms of modernity, and there are several books that are being written on him. So let me speak now about, this is a long introduction, and I've included some things already that I'm going to say later, so it won't be as long, but let me now talk about the book in the context of early modernity. The book is about Kabbalah and science, and a fusion of the two. Basically, in the introduction to the book, Hurwitz says, I am writing this book as a commentary on the work by a man named Chaim Vital. Vital was the most important colleague and expositor of Lurianic Kabbalah who lived in the 16th century. All that we know about Isaac Luria's Kabbalah is primarily through Vital and then later interpreters of Lurianic Kabbalah. So he wrote down Luria, but he also created, as we know now from the work of Ronit Meroz and others, an independent understanding of Kabbalah, magic, medicine, all of these things. One of the small books that he published, one of the interesting things about Lurianic Kabbalah is that it becomes more accessible from the 16th century on, the Kabbalah, the Jewish mystical tradition, emerges in the form of popular works. 16th, and especially the 17th and 18th century. Much of it was done by the followers of Shabtai Tzvi themselves. They published these moral, mystical texts, which became extremely popular and accessible to non-Kabbalists. So what we're speaking about is a book of this vein. One of the books that Vital published was a work called Sha'arei Kedusha, or The Gates of Holiness. What is this book? It is a book on, you read this little book and you can become a prophet. This is what we were talking about before. In other words, it's a moralistic text. It's a text which describes how you discipline yourself, how you watch your weight, how you perform all kinds of good deeds, how you put yourself in a kind of mystical mood, and how you are moral and ethical, and then ultimately you can imbibe the Ruach HaKodesh. Hurwitz sees this book, which is a very popular book, by the way, which has many, many editions, and he says, I'm going to write a commentary on this book because there's one thing missing. He didn't talk about nature and the natural world. He didn't talk about science. He meant to talk about science, but it's not there. It's hard to read the book and find anything about science in the Vital book. But nevertheless, essentially, Sefer ha-Brit is a commentary on Sha'arei Kedusha. And perhaps the brilliance of doing it this way was it sold, because people thought it was a commentary on a Kabbalistic, moralistic work. It's a book on science, and he argued that science is really the background of Sha'arei Kedusha, and it seems to me rather contrived, artificial, except the first part of the book, which is 400 pages, which is all about science. The second part is all about the mystical moral journey. That is much more related to Sha'arei Kedusha of Vital. So indeed, by the end of the book, you are very much in the mystical, magical world of Chaim Vital, so it is related. The first part of the book, it seems to be rather artificial, the connection. In any case, Kabbalah and science, that is a field that I don't want to say I discovered in the 1980s. I discovered for myself for sure. But but what we are speaking about, and those of you that are early modernists will know what I'm speaking about, already in the 60s and 70s, but more in the 80s, a great controversy broke out in the history of science, stimulated by the work of Francis Yates. Dame Francis Yates at the Warburg Institute in London published a work on Giordano Bruno, the great science figure, and then she published an essay called The Hermetic Origins of Modern Science. Now, Hermeticism is the term that is used in the Renaissance to describe a group of magical spiritual texts that were originally written in Egypt and the ancient Near East, that were came to us in Greek and were translated by a group of Renaissance philosophers, particularly Marsilio Ficino in Italy, and also Pico della Mirandola as part of this whole world, and so on. These Hermetic texts deal with nature, the natural world, natural processes, and so on. What she discovered in the case of Bruno, in the case of Newton, in the case of a whole group of scientists of the early modern period, that these people were deeply embedded in this spiritual, magical world, that they knew about these texts, that they were fascinated by them, that this is a very deep part of the Renaissance. And therefore, the relationship between Hermeticism, as she called it, and spirituality and science is much more direct. Now, for the positivistic historians of science, this was unheard of. Science is a liberation from mysticism, from religion. And if you look at the historiography of the history of science in the 19th century, it is the warfare between science and religion. It is the story of Galileo, standing up against the Catholic Church and so on. But she was arguing that essentially that's all wrong, that there is a religious background to modern science, and that rather than seeing modern science as a revolution against the spirituality and religion, take the example of Newton. Newton writes not only about Newtonian physics, he writes about prophecy. If you want to see his Newton manuscripts, go to Jerusalem, and there you will see all these religious manuscripts. He's deeply embedded in the biblical text and in biblical prophecy and the coming of the Messiah and so on. This is Newton. If this is Newton, and take a whole group of other characters. So this debate began, and of course Yates ended up in the middle of this. At this period of time, she discovered a close friend of mine, Moshe Idel, who was writing about the Kabbalah. She didn't know anything about the Kabbalah. She knew all about mysticism and so on, but she didn't know a word of Hebrew, and therefore she couldn't. But she then discovered that a character like Pico della Mirandola was deeply embedded in the Kabbalah. He had Hebrew teachers. He was learning Hebrew, so that Hebrew was a part of this rediscovery of the Greek world. There was also a very important Hebraic dimension, and in particular a Kabbalistic dimension. So this is the background in which I wrote this book in the 1980s on Avram Yagel, who was a student of Yochanan Alimano, who was one of Pico's own teachers, and was a physician and a scientist, and was also interested in the Kabbalah. And I tried to argue that here was a Jewish version of the kind of character that Yates was speaking about. And if one traces Italian Jewish thought from this period on, I can give you a lot of names, they won't mean very much to you, but Alimano, Yagel, particularly a very important figure in the 17th century, Yashar Mikandia, Yosef del Medigo, was an absolute critical figure in this story. He writing on Kabbalah. Is he a Kabbalist or is he a scientist? He writes about physics, he writes about Kabbalah in a work called Sefer Elim. He writes about both. He integrates the Kabbalistic system within a scientific world. So what I'm describing here is a very interesting process. Beginning in the 16th century, a group of Italian Jewish thinkers primarily, who are interested, who are anti-philosophical, anti-Maimonides, or Maimonides is of course scholastic philosophy, are who see philosophy as undermining the very foundations of Jewish faith, but embracing at the same time natural philosophy, the natural world. In other words, the separation between physics and metaphysics is what I'm speaking about. This is a very important thought process that engages, of course, early modern Europe in general. For Jews, this is a critique against Maimonidean philosophy, against the medievals. Begins with Chazgai Kreskis, the critique against Maimonides, and then an embrace of the Kabbalah. In other words, the Kabbalah becomes important to Christians in the 15th, 16th century, but it also becomes important to Jews. The 16th century is the critical moment for the Kabbalah for Jews in terms of Isaac Luria and the community in Safed, but also in terms of the publication for the first time of the classic work of the Kabbalah called the Sefer HaZohar, the Book of Splendor. And some scholars now argue that essentially before the 16th century, there wasn't a Sefer HaZohar, that the Sefer HaZohar was canonized, became a complete book in its two printings in the 16th century. And even before the Jews had printed the Kabbalah, the Zohar in Hebrew, the Zohar was appearing in Latin. In other words, the reason why Jews, some scholars argue, began to publish all of this material in Hebrew was because Christians were doing it already, and they were beating them to the punch, basically. And the Jews needed to catch up and to present authentic editions of their own texts. So we have here a kind of rivalry, a kind of between Jews and Christians in publishing these texts. For Pico, Kabbalah was the way to understand Jesus. Kabbalah brings us back to the first century. It brings us back to the origins of Christianity and Judaism. Kabbalah is the secret by way we can understand the magical universe, which is Neoplatonic, Hermetic, Neoplatonic, Pythagorean. All of these cultures are coming together. This is the background for understanding Renaissance Jewish thought, which is obviously plays off the Christian side of this. This is all early modern. I haven't said a word about Hurwitz, but you see, you can understand Hurwitz without understanding this previous background. I could also mention, I mentioned Jacob Hart already, his colleague in London, now back to Hurwitz in the 18th century. But I could also mention another very important figure in the history of modern Jewish thought, named Solomon Maimon, late 18th, 19th century. Maimon writes a commentary on Maimonides called Givat HaMoreh, but he also writes a Kabbalistic text. So you see this very interesting fusion, coagination between Kabbalah, science, philosophy, continues right up into the 18th and 19th century. One other thing about the early modern, and we'll be done with this first part. I'm sorry it's taking so long, but I'm going to move faster now. And that is, he says this is an encyclopedia. By the way, look at the cover. This is, I purchased this in Mea Sha'arim in Jerusalem. You can still get it, very easy. The Hasidim are still reading this book. This is modern science. In fact, one of the most extraordinary things when I was studying this book was, the Haredim, the very Orthodox Jews, have chat lines on internet. What's the one called? You know the famous one that you ever go, Sichat something, I forget what it's called. So I go on it, and they're discussing whether they should read Sefer ha-Brit or not. I mean, this is an 18th century work, This is modern science, And it was absolutely incredible. My friend Yitzhak Malamed, who is a kind of neo-Chassid, pointed me to these chat lines, and I was absolutely amazed. They're discussing this page after page of this book. In any case, if you want to get a copy of this book, it's sold in the probably in Brooklyn as well. You can buy the book and so on. They read this as what they call modern science. But what encyclopedia? What I want to suggest is that in the early modern period as well, beginning with Avram Yagel and Del Medigo, some of the same people I've mentioned and several others, we have encyclopedia of this kind. In other words, there is such a thing as the medieval encyclopedia, which is more a philosophical kind of summary, particularly in the late 13th, 14th century. Steve Harvey has written on these encyclopedias, but this is an early modern encyclopedia, which is very much influenced by Neoplatonism, very much influenced by magic, by Hermeticism. Alimano wrote also an encyclopedia, and in some respects we could compare the encyclopedia, which I see as a quintessential Italian Jewish cultural phenomenon, with this work. In other words, it is linked. We even have a medical encyclopedia, which I have written about in my book that Javier mentioned, called Masei Tuvia Kohen. He was a graduate of the University of Padua, which is an extremely important early modern text. And we also have an encyclopedia of Talmud. The first, in Hebrew today we have the Encyclopedia Talmudit, but its precursor was a work called the Pachad Yitzchak, by a Jew of Ferrara named Yitzchak Lampronte, who tries to reorganize rabbinic knowledge in encyclopedic form, which is an extraordinary reorganization of knowledge. It's a restructuring of Jewish knowledge in the 18th century. So the encyclopedia is a form which has a long history in early modern Europe, particularly in Italy. All right. However, I want to suggest, and we will get to it now in a second, there are specific instructions on publishing this book. And while he calls this an encyclopedia, he argues that unlike the encyclopedias that we know, you have to read it from cover to cover. You can't just read it selectively. He makes this explicit. So in a certain way, this is not exactly an early modern encyclopedia, or an encyclopedia, and certainly not a modern one, like the Philosophe Encyclopedia. It's more like a medieval encyclopedia, whereby you begin and you're taking a journey, and you ultimately end up with the truth at the end. In that sense, it's a throwback to something that is even more medieval. All right, so now that was part one, and now part two will be much shorter, because some of this I've already talked about. I mentioned that Hurwitz was not a... So my point is that while there are early modern background is very critical here, to understand the relationship between Kabbalah and science and so forth, this is still not an early modern book, it's a modern book. And that's what I want to show you in the rest of my lecture. So this is not a university professor. He's an autodidact. He knows Yiddish and Hebrew and maybe some German, as I said. His discovery of the scientific world is limited. But he's not a university-trained scholar like some of the people that I've mentioned, like Del Medigo or Tuvia. These people all went to medical school. And they became university kind of professors of medicine, not here. His sources are a variety. First, he relies very much on the library of Hebrew works on the history of science and medicine that begin in the early modern period. These are works that I have spent my career studying. I could list a whole series of names, but I won't. In his own generation, during the Enlightenment period, a number of Hebrew authors are composing scientific texts, some of them for children, some of them for adults. So we have here, within the Haskalah period, a educational agenda of learning of Jewish students who need to study science and the natural world. People like Israel Zamosh, Schnaber Levinson, Jacob Hart, Baruch Schick, Baruch Lindau. These are all individuals who wrote textbooks on science. What is wonderful about this book is that, I guess like some university professors, sometimes he gives you the source and sometimes he just copies without giving the source. Haven't you met colleagues like that before? You know, they think they can sort of cover their bases by mentioning your name at the end of a small footnote, but they essentially copied the first 10 pages of your work. Anyway, that's the way, you know, I guess it was the norm in the 18th century. I guess it's still the norm in the 21st century. Clearly, he relies very heavily on this Hebrew library of science. But nevertheless, if one looks, one can find Copernicus, Newton, atomism, chemical philosophy. I'm giving you some of the topics that he talks about in the book, the measurement of air and water. He mentions contemporaries such as Blanchard and his helium balloon, Buchner, Christian Raff, George Buffon, and others. Most impressive, and this is the one thing that I have already published, is a long essay on Edward Jenner and smallpox, the discovery of the smallpox vaccine, in England about the same time, and a remarkable story of how in Krakow the rabbis all gather every Jewish kid and have him inoculated, which is very different from certain Christian clerics who found, you know, I mean, you know what the smallpox vaccine does. Basically, you're putting in the germs from the disease into your, and it creates antibodies which then, of course, beat the disease. So it was very controversial. But nevertheless, the Jews are at the forefront of inoculating, and he describes this in great detail. What is interesting for him are the new discoveries of science that upset and challenge the old paradigms of knowledge. So he has a long chapter on the diving bell, on the helium balloon, on lightning rods, on sound machines, and so on. All of them reflecting God's providence. In other words, human beings thought they were smart, they knew everything, they knew all the truth. But look, every day we make a new discovery, we show how fragile human knowledge is, how little we really know, how everything can be overturned, and isn't God's providence is wonderful. I mean, that's really basically the spirit of this book and in his description of these discoveries. What is most interesting is while this is a traditional Jew, who my colleague Shmuel Feiner calls an Orthodox Jew, and I strongly disagree with that label. I think the label doesn't mean anything in the case of this man. He uses historical knowledge and philosophical knowledge to strengthen his traditional position. One of the most interesting aspects of this book is his evocation of Immanuel Kant. Kant plays a very important role in this book. Why Kant? Because Kant's critique of metaphysical knowledge is exactly what Horowitz needs. In other words, I love nature and science, but I hate philosophy, right? Because philosophy gets us nowhere. We can never know the truth. So what I can do now is first we study the natural world, the material world that we live in, but it is connected to the astral world, and it is connected to the divine world above. In other words, the metaphysics that I adopt is, of course, the Kabbalah. So here's how the Kabbalah and science and nature go together. In other words, and the confirmation of this is Immanuel Kant. Did he actually read Immanuel Kant? No. He read Shlomo Maimon, his Hebrew book on his commentary on Maimonides, in which he describes in 2 pages Kant's understanding, and he criticizes it. Maimon gets into an argument with Kant. It's a very interesting philosophical debate. But, so Hurwitz criticizes Maimon and says Kant is a wonderful person. And he goes on, and only in the page and a half that he knows, but he understands the insight. He understands the point that here is a philosopher who is criticizing philosophers for their audacity in saying they knew everything. You can't know everything. There are things you can know, practical knowledge, and there are things, pure knowledge that you cannot know. And therefore it is only an hypothesis. For him, that is a brilliant point. That is a critical point for him in working this out.
And the universal morality also, no? That's Kant.
Exactly. All right, so we're getting to that. We're very close. I'm glad you're thinking ahead. Excellent. Okay. Now, before I get to loving one's neighbor, which I'm very close to, I want to show you one more text, and we're not going to really read it. We don't have the time, but I just want to show it to you. I have it here in English. You'll forgive me, this goes slow, but we'll pass through a bunch of things. This, by the way, is the introduction to the first edition of Brun, where he refuses to give his name. There's a long reason why. He says he was blind and he prayed to God and he made a vow that he would never put his name on his book. But nevertheless, if you read the red letters, you'll see that his name is spelled out. So I mean, it's not such an invisible. But of course, that caused him great anguish, because then they easily took the book in the second edition and did a pirated version of it, and he was extremely upset. And this made him focus on the whole idea of printing and the printing world and printers and booksellers and so on. And he became fascinated, as you will see, with this topic, which I'm now moving to. And I just want to show you. Let's see, what is it I got here? Hold on a second. All right, we're skipping that part.
Cancel.
Cancel?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay. All right, here it is. I'm just going to get to the beginning of it. So, in the second edition of the book, he revises the book completely, adds 350 citations, 350 and makes it a much longer book, and then gives us this extraordinary printing instructions. We have at Penn a whole, I don't know how important this is for your institution, but the history of material text is a very large field at Penn. We have two super giants. One is Peter Stelibras and the other is Roger Chartier, who regularly teach a group of very enthusiastic students the history of the book, the history of material texts. And I presented these instructions, and with Chartier sitting over there, I was very nervous, of course. And he loved this. He said he's never saw anything like this before. So what you have here is a bookseller. In other words, why is this interesting? Because there is an extraordinary self-awareness and pride of authorship by the second edition, not the first edition, and a sense of the power of print. He speaks at length about his own experience in printing the book, the pirated edition, the number of copies. He says 2,000 were sold immediately, and he tells you all the cities it was published, how it was disseminated. He collected 7 rabbinic haskamot, that is, rabbinic approbations. He talks about his acclaim as a printed author. He refers to editions of the books, to manuscripts, and most importantly, he is an aggressive salesman who is traveling all around Europe selling the book. The letter he writes to Carl Fischer is all about, will you count how many books are in Prague, because I want to bring in a whole new supply, and will you advocate the book for me? He has enough chutzpah to ask the censor to help him sell the book as well. So what we have here is a real bookseller, and in this sense it is very much part of the modern world that he is living in here. And he succeeds. I mean, as you see, he's an extraordinarily gifted salesman. So there is a lot here. Now, I don't have time to really go into this, but this is an incredible text. It goes on for 3 pages. And just take a quick look at some of it. He will publish, so these are the instructions that he gives to the printer. He will publish this later edition, not the first edition. The paper will be good and attractive but strong. Why can't I get my mouse to... Oh, here it is. The letters will be large or mid-size. One should not subtract anything from the book. The end of the first part shall be published on the same page with the beginning of the second part. And he goes on. There will be, shall not be an index of any chapter or discourse regarding any specific matter or another, or any specific page without any other matter as the custom in other books. Where an index exists to find a desired item at the book's beginning or end, one should not follow this practice in this book for two reasons. First, because most of the matters in this book are not concentrated in one place, they're all over the place. But notice the second reason. The second reason he's not going to tell us, it's secret. So this is about the secret Kabbalistic aura of the book. The format of the book shall be quarto. Notice on bogan papier, not half a bogan. Abbreviations. He describes how the book shall be printing. Wait, I went too fast. Oh no, that's the philosophical part I'm giving you here. Wait, I'm sorry, I skipped that part. Wait, what's happening? All right, here we go. I just want to show you the end. I have seen the stress, that is the pressure applied to the printing press, the craft called press and zeer. I am disgusted with my life. This is all these biblical texts. It's beautiful in Hebrew. Because of their pressers and pushers, most of whom are slothful and will not press with full human strength, so as to make a good, solid impression on the paper with ink equally uniform across the sheet. Subsequently, the letters are not properly absorbed with ink of the book, especially if the paper is fit for writing, called shri papier. These letters will not be well recognizable, and therefore there will be what he calls rifaim, ghosts, weak impressions. Consequently, the printer should carefully supervise his pressers, and he should order them to push and press hard the printing press with a strong hand, and so the paper can fully absorb the letters in the wooden board. So you have to have a picture of the early modern printing press to appreciate all of these extraordinary instructions here, which I hope to provide in the book itself. So anyway, so that's part 2. Now I'm going to get to part 3. You see, are we making progress? What time is it? I got to take
20 past.
Oh, so we're in good shape, right? Oh no, I'm supposed to finish at 12:30. What time? I'm supposed to finish at 12:30. All right. So a few more minutes. I'm not doing a your friend from Paris thing though. All right. So all right. She knows what I'm talking about. Okay. So part 3. Here's the text. So I just want to show you this. It's taking me time because I'm so slow with this, but give me a minute. So now we're talking about his morality, his moral cosmopolitanism. And here I'm going to try to abbreviate this a little bit more, but I want to show you go to the beginning. All right. Here's the beginning of Ahavat Re'im. I'm just going to read the first 2 or 3 lines. The essence of the love of neighbors is to love the entire human race, regardless of which nation or language one belongs to, since every human being is made of the divine likeness and image and occupies himself with the betterment of the world by building, plowing, planting, trading, selling, or in a craft, or in conceiving of insights and approaches to acquire worldly needs. He generates his thinking as not to neglect the needs of other creatures, and so on and so forth. For through these things the world stands properly and exists in perfection, while all these things exist, God created and made them, and they are very good in every human being. And then he talks about the exceptions, which are typical Enlightenment exceptions, which I'm not going to read. So here we have an extraordinary chapter devoted, as I said, right before you reach the divine presence, right at the end of the book. You need to love non-Jews. Now, I could go on for a long time about this, but let me just summarize my conclusion. If you look at the history of the exegesis, this is an exegesis on, and you shall love your neighbor as yourself, from the book of Leviticus. If you look at the history of Jewish exegesis on this line, almost exclusively until the 18th century, Jews understand Re'ah as Jew, not as Christian. Loving your neighbor as yourself. One of the formulations of that text, of course, is the famous formulation of Hillel, who makes it into a negative. In other words, not you shall love your neighbor as yourself. That's Jesus' position. But Hillel's position is you shall not do unto others as you would not have them do unto you. In other words, a more practical kind of moral posture. You can't love everybody, right? I mean, I'd love to love you all, but I'm not going to love you all. But I won't hurt you. I mean, I won't interfere with your life. I'll treat you with the same respect that I want to treat myself. In any case, that's one aspect. But the other aspect is that when Jews interpret this line in the rabbinic age, and there are many scholarly works on this subject, which I could quote to you. One of the most interesting is a wonderful essay by Uri Simon, who was the great biblical scholar at the Hebrew University. His father, Ernst Simon, who argues at the end of the article, I wish there was one Jewish voice that would say that you should love all humanity, not just Jews. So basically, Jews are very chauvinistic. In other words, there is a double morality within Jewish tradition, which is quite prominent, between loving Jews versus loving non-Jews. By the 18th century, this is changing, of course. Mendelssohn speaks about a toleration between Jews and Christian, and a whole group of others, Emden, Eibishitz, and so on, all of them come very close to universalizing the morality of Jews. Under the pressure of emancipation and enlightenment, of course, individuals are arguing that, of course, Jews can't talk about the goy or the non-Jew in negative terms. And there's clearly an attempt to clean up the act and so on. But I would argue that there's no one that, like this chapter, that goes 50 pages to describe this in extraordinary detail. Moreover, it's placed within a religious message, right? You can't receive the divine image without loving non-Jews. That's an extraordinary statement. And this is not written by a reformed Jew from Germany, and a liberal Jew, like me. It's written by a traditionalist, a Kabbalist from Eastern Europe, from Krakow and from Vilna. So it becomes all the more interesting, right? You can't say this is part of a liberal ideology that emerged, in the 19th century. We have two examples in the 19th century, going back to Italian Jewish thought, who speak openly about loving non-Jews. One of them is Shadal, Samuel David Luzzatto, the head of the Paduan Seminary in the 19th century, and the other is Eliyahu Ben Amozeg, who also embraces a kind of Kabbalistic universal vision of humanity and so on. But these are later than Hurwitz. Hurwitz is earlier, and Hurwitz, of course, is Eastern European Ashkenazic. He's not Italian. Italian Jews, amore, that's easy. It's in Italy. Eastern Europe is a different story. So here I want to suggest. And the interesting thing about this text, he doesn't give you any sources. He says, I'm inventing all of this because I can't find many Jewish sources that justify my position. So let me just get by this. I'm doing it slowly because I don't want to lose it, but it's too slow. Wait, I'm going to go a little faster. Yeah, now, why are these there? That's Javier and... no, it's not Javier. Those, if I get to them, I will. But here's the text that I want to get to. At the beginning of the text, here he presents this story. And as you can see, it is the story of a very famous duke named Leopold, who in the 17th of ER, in the spring of 1785, the Oder River rose, and several villages were overwhelmed, and people were drowning. So Leopold, this young 32-year-old prince, the commandant of the city, gets in a boat and goes out to save his people, but the water currents overturned his boat and he was drowned. Now, what is this story doing in this very mystical Jewish text? Well, this opened up a whole world for me, and I discovered that Leopold of Brunswick, the Menschenfreund, becomes a celebrated cultural icon of the end of the 18th century. German poets like Schiller, Goethe, and Lessing all write poems in his honor. He is celebrated in French poetry, in German poetry, and, if you don't believe me, the artists of the end of the 18th century take this story and make it into a fabulous picture. All right, look at that one. There it is, Leopold. Menno Haas, painting of Daniel Chodovecki, Hurwitz, who's very famous. He's a very famous Enlightenment, isn't that beautiful? Getting on his boat. And here's another one that's really powerful. By James Northcote, which is English. So we're talking about how this image extends. Now, what is the background of this? And here's what I want to suggest. I mean, I have no way of proving this. But the interesting thing about Leopold was that he was trained as a young prince to be educated for all of humanity. And his teacher was Lessing. And Lessing took him on a trip 10 years before he died to Italy, in which he saw the culture of humanism in Italy. He became a Mason, a Freemason, and he became part of this whole Masonic culture at the end of the 18th century. Now, in Germany at this time, we have, by the way, Jacob Katz, if you recall, Javier, wrote a book many years ago called Freemasons and Jews, which was about Freemasonry in Germany. The story is a sad story. Originally, Freemasonry was what Katz called a kind of neutral space in the 18th century, where Jews could enter Masonic lodges even though they were Jews. The Masons had the ritual of the temple. They were fascinated by Hebrew words, and they were extremely excited by notions of ancient biblical culture and traditions. And they believed that everyone could be a Masonic brother. So therefore, before emancipation, Jews were invited into Masonic lodges throughout Europe. Now, in my English book on Jewish Enlightenment and English Key, I worked in the Masonic Lodge in London, which is a fabulous place. We also have a great Masonic Lodge in Philadelphia with beautiful rooms. Did you see the Masonic Lodge when you were there? In the Masonic Lodge, I found not only all of my thinkers who I was studying were Masons, all the Jews, but I also found Jewish lodges. The idea was to integrate Jews and Christians, but the Jews, of course, brought in their kosher food and wanted to have their separate Jewish lodges. So they created their own Jewish Masons. I actually gave a lecture on Masonry and Judaism in London, and I asked my audience, are any of you Masons? And the whole audience stood up. I mean, Jews are still big, at least in England, with Freemasonry. I don't know, are there Freemasons in Spain? Yeah, all right, okay. So in any case, what I want to argue here is that the Masonic background, at the end of the 18th century, the notion of universal brotherhood, the notion of that we were all created in the same, and the evocation of this remarkable story is not just fortuitous. Lessing is critical here, because Lessing, of course, was a very close friend of Mendelssohn. Lessing wrote the Masonic Dialogue, which is a great text of Masonry. And perhaps the background of all of this is really relevant. Now, I could show you one more picture. I have to conclude this quickly because I'm running out of time, but at the end of Ahavat Re'im is a wonderful story about, he gives a midrash, a kind of homily on the kruvim, on the cherubs that were on the Ark of the Holy, in the Bible. And he says the two cherubs look like little children. And put two children, now I'm a recent grandfather, I have a 3-year-old grandchild. Put a little child in the middle of the room and he'll play with his little toys. But stick another child next to him and all of a sudden they'll look at each other and they'll enjoy each other and they will start to play with each other and they will smile at each other. I'm not sure I saw that. My grandchild likes to fight with kids. But anyway, he gives this sermon saying, look, loving another human being is an instinct from childhood, from birth. And so he ends with this story. Now, so what I did was, I said, cherubs, that must be Masonic. So I found in one of the Masonic texts, here are the cherubs, they're doing their unity, loving each other and so on. I don't know if that is related at all, but nevertheless, it's a nice idea. So what I'm suggesting here is that within the context of a scientific text, a Kabbalistic text, we have here a radical critique of Jewish chauvinism. There was also a critique of the Jews of Amsterdam that Ashkenazim and Sephardim can't get along with each other. They're fighting each other. In other words, he takes the same critique and now turns it on the Jews and say, why can't we love everybody? Why are we fighting even among ourselves? And then he analyzes, parents and children and uncles and aunts and wives and husbands and how all of us need to sort of celebrate each other's humanity. Did this come from Jewish sources? Perhaps. Was this something that was idiosyncratic to Hurwitz? Or indeed, is there a Masonic background for all of this? Now later on, of course, the Freemasons in Germany, things change. Romanticism, nationalism, racism, and these Masonic lodges kick out their Jews. But at this time, at the end of the 18th century, there is still this kind of brotherhood feeling and this sense. Take, for example, the Mozart, the Ode, Mozart was very influenced by Freemasonry and so on. So all of these themes of universal brotherhood are around and are in the air. Okay, I come to my last part. So I want to suggest in terms of this text that it might have indigenous roots, and I could argue that as well, but I want to argue essentially for a Masonic background. My final is the legacy of this text. Okay, so we're on the last part, and it's I'm going to end within, I'll just give you one or two examples and stop. I can't remember if it's forward or back. Let's go through this quickly. Yeah, here it is. All right, I'm not going to do. All right. I just want to show you what I can say, just to summarize, because I don't really want to spend much more time, is that essentially this text universally is accepted by Jews. First you have the Maskilim, the enlightened Jews, the secularized Jews. But you know who love this text? The Hasidim. It's very interesting. He criticizes Shabtai Tzvi very strongly here, but he doesn't criticize Hasidut, and he could, but he doesn't. The Hasidim picked this up. The person who loved this text was Nachman of Breslov, and all of his disciples. It's quoted all over the place. All of it. When he refers to Anshe HaTeva, the naturalists, it is always Sefer ha-Brit that he's quoting here. But I want to just show you very quickly a few more. Let me start with one that is really cute. I don't know if you knew, at EE.UU, the great institution of Eastern European Jewish culture, which survived the Holocaust, in the 30s, in its devotion to Yiddish culture, asked young people in Eastern Europe to write essays in Yiddish, and they ran an essay contest. These essays were preserved in New York EE.UU today, and they were written right before the Holocaust. And here is one written in Yiddish by a young boy named Chenech in 1934. He was a student at the Chofetz Chaim Yeshiva in Radon, a very famous yeshiva. And he writes, I obtained a copy of the Book of the Covenant, that's the Sefer ha-Brit, and virtually committed it to memory, reading it in the bathroom for fear of being caught and confronted with a whole new series of accusations. This is what I call Sefer ha-Brit in the toilet, the asio. Why he had to do it in the toilet, I'm not sure exactly, because traditional Jews were reading this text, but that's the first one. The second one is from the first Yiddish edition here, and the reason why I gave this text is because it talks about, he makes it into a Sefer Kodesh. This is a holy book, it looks like a holy book, that you would buy and so on. So you can see why it's sold. But I want to go to this third text, which I think is the most interesting. I don't know how many of you know who Chatam Sofer is. Chatam Sofer was the great rabbi of the Orthodox movement in the 19th century from Pressburg. He actually corresponds, or there is a dialogue between him and Hurwitz. But Chatam Sofer is well known for his very famous line, Kol Chadash min HaTorah Asur. Anything that is new is forbidden by the Torah. That's, I think you would call conservatism, right? That would be like American Republicans, the Tea Party in America. Anything new that Obama wants is forbidden by the Torah. So that's a pretty arch-conservative position. So all of a sudden we have this extraordinary text, which you can read, from the grandson of Chatam Sofer. He found the book. He was writing a book on the sciences for his students. He found the book and he said it's a wonderful book. Now, let me just show you one more and then I'm going to stop. There's a reaction here. I'm skipping that part of their exchange. Joseph Pearl, of course, was a critic of the Hasidic movement, but talks about how a Hasid referred to thunder and lightning rods. That whole section is taken from Sefer ha-Brit. There's no question about it. Solomon Schechter was the founder of the Jewish Theological Seminary of America. He talks about him coming to America as a young immigrant with Sefer ha-Brit in his hand. And finally, let me see if I get, oh no, I skipped that part. Let me just one more and then I'm done. Where Schneerson is, around, let's take Rob Schach. When I went to Israel at the age of 17 for the first time, someone took me to visit the Pontovich Yeshiva in Tel Aviv, or in Bnei Brak. Pontovich Yeshiva is really arch-Orthodox. I mean, that's, and all they do there is study Talmud. It's a Lithuanian yeshiva that's been transported into Israel. And the great spiritual mentor of this place was Eliezer Schach, the ultra-Orthodox rabbi. So here is the story of how someone tried to remove the book. It sat in the front of his table, and he got really angry, and he says, when I read his words, it serves for me as a support for the coming of the Messiah. This messianic text. It's amazing how the readers of this book, from all different angles, in other words, whatever their ideology, it didn't matter, they found something that was attractive and exciting about this book, and so on. Now I could list a whole group of Ladino writers, a whole group of Sephardic writers, Ish Chai, what's his name, the famous posek in Iraq, quotes this book all over the place. There are, I found over 100 references, which make up a long chapter of the book, to suggest that indeed this is a book that was celebrated because it was, these traditional Jews thought it was a kosher way of entering into the non-Jewish space of modernity. Did it succeed in doing that? I'm not sure, right? But it was clearly read and appreciated, and thus was a vehicle by which traditional Jews were maneuvering, were negotiating their space within the non-Jewish world. So I want to bring this to a close by saying that I have covered more or less the 4 parts, but I wanted to suggest indeed that while the origins of this book lie within the early modern period, particularly the merger between Kabbalah and science, what you have here is also a modern book, a book that on the one hand comes from a traditionalist, on the other hand introduces the traditional reader to the world of nature and science, at the same time is offering a radical social critique of Jewish morality, and arguing in a way that is really way beyond, I mean, most Jews of his own time, and at the same time is a businessman, is a salesman, is a person who understood the book trade and could make it a part of a larger cultural space. So I hope my argument wins some acceptance on your part, in that it is not just a book, but it is a book that is an interesting book to understand something about how Jews enter the modern world. Thank you very much. Hour and 15 minutes, so I apologize. Well, we started a little later, it's hour and 10 minutes.
I will refer later on to your friend and my friend, and how I would connect both lectures.
Okay, all right, good.
Let's open
So we have some time, so please...
let's open the floor now for questions, so please make your questions, and I won't take advantage of my position here. I will ask at the end. I have many questions, so I guess that some other people will have some questions. So who wants to?
Just a small question. This fantastic text about the contract of how he wants to publish the book, is that going to be part of your book?
Yes, it's an appendix. I translated the whole thing, and it's an appendix.
But you haven't published it yet?
No. In fact, I'm now working on I'm going to do a version of it for Tony Grafton Festschrift, which is supposed to be secret. I don't know if you know about it. And I'm going to do a version in Hebrew also, but it's going to be in my book as well. And it is really quite remarkable. You couldn't read it that quickly. I could give you a copy of it if you wanted it, but it's issues of abbreviations, of how you print it, of how you press, and so on. And what I want to try to do is illustrate it with some really good pictures, so you can really see what's going on here in terms of the printing press and how much he actually knew. And then there are several other texts which I did not include, which talk about at the end of the first edition. And I don't know how common this is. I assume it's not totally unique. I mean, I'm sure other books have it. But he has a long statement. He says, if you want to buy the book, here are 20 of my friends in different cities who have copies of the book and are willing to sell. So he lists his whole network and some of them I can identify, some of them I can't. And at least a dozen cities throughout Central and Eastern Europe where you can buy the book. So he's really selling the book constantly. There's also, in the first review of the book, which appeared in ha-Sefer, which is the major journal of the Haskalah, the author criticizes the book because he doesn't like his Hebrew style. I mean, it's a kind of silly review. He likes, of course, appreciates what he's doing, but when he gets to the Kabbalah, the author has no patience for that. But then he makes a very interesting footnote. He says, there's a horrible practice these days of authors selling their books directly to rich people and avoiding the middleman, the book dealers. And it's put in a context that it sounds like Hurwitz. In other words, he's a kind of indirect comment about the way Hurwitz is selling his book. So you're absolutely right. I think all of these texts, particularly this text itself, are really interesting and unique and add something to the history of the book. And while this had not been my field earlier, I've been drawn into it, and I really want to do something with it.
And I wanted a little footnote in Lady Montague's letter to when she goes to Istanbul, and she spends quite a time in the Balkans. There's a new edition now, and she tells, I think it's in the Balkans, about Muslim women taking the children and lifting their skin and putting a little bit of a smallpox on it.
Ah, isn't that interesting?
And I think it's more or less the same.
The same kind of thing, yes.
Yeah, the same kind of thing and the same epoch. I mean,
Yes,
I think
yes,
she's
yeah.
contemporary.
End of the 18th, early 19th century.
Yeah.
Right, exactly, yeah. What I did in the essay that I published in a journal called Aleph, which is a journal on science and Judaism, I published several other Jewish responses to smallpox, some of them positive, some of them negative. But this one is the most elaborate, and he really knows all about Jenner and all about the disease, and gives us a kind of short history of it, and then actually presents this case of this rabbi in Krakow. He says 2,000 Jews were inoculated, which is really quite extraordinary. At the same time, however, he is still reluctant to accept Copernicus. So, it's kind of weird. I mean, at the end of the 18th century, and Jacob Hart actually, which he produces the letter in, his friend in London says, are you kidding? This is so silly. But he doesn't want to contradict the biblical verse, that the sun stood still and so on. So his science has limitations. On the one hand, it can be way out there, like his social criticism. And the other hand, he's still very traditional and conservative. Other question, go on.
I have a comment. Thank you very much for the last part about the different readers of this book, because it explains very well how it works like an encyclopedia. Because now you explained, because I was not very sure about the Kabbalah and science part is quite clear. But the ethic part is also very, very important. I missed that when we were speaking. So I would just like to comment. We found actually 3 versions different in Ladino of this book, in Judeo-Spanish. So one is a mere translation. So you just have translation to Judeo-Spanish of this book. It is not probably the complete work, but more or less it is a version in Judeo-Spanish. Then the second book we have, it is just inspired by Sefer ha-Brit, and it is another invention of 2 Sephardic authors. And the third thing, this is really weird, I have it here, it's a reproduction of three different texts in Ladino. One of them is Sefer ha-Brit, one of them is a novel, Balt HaTeshuvah, and another one is Robinson Crusoe. And now I understand why did because this was published in a Sephardic newspaper from Salonika. And now I can understand, they just wanted to, do some ethics for the readers and also some entertainment.
Yeah.
So that was the point. So now I have this. So thank you very much, David. It is clear.
And as I mentioned to you privately, there is a young woman who's we're publishing her book on the exotic in the travel literature of the Haskalah. It's really an interesting book. And she's working the translations of Robinson Crusoe into Hebrew. So that should be, connected. I mean, the Ladino translations of Robinson Crusoe and how it's juxtaposed with Sefer ha-Brit. So we have all of this, together. I mean, it's and you know, sort of exotic. So it is an exotic book. On the one hand, it's a very pious book. On the other hand, it meets all of the needs of the readers. So you know, you can come at it from any point of view. But I also want to underscore the fact that the Sephardim, not only the Ladino, but the Sephardim who worked in Judeo-Arabic, in Iraq, we have comments on this book, and we also have a whole series of Sheilot and Shuvot that deal with issues of halacha and science, where they cite Sefer ha-Brit as a halachic source, as a legal source, which is really quite interesting. So a whole group of rabbis are also quoting him in this context. So you know, it's the kind of book you can find anything you want.
Yeah,
and you know, was there opposition to this book? There really wasn't. It amazingly passed all musters. I have one example in the beginning of the chapter on the readers, where a maskil who criticizes a chassid, they actually got into a polemic with each other. Both of them cite from Sefer ha-Brit. So you know, which is really a good example of how all of the sides sort of came together with this kind of neutral book.
And in that sense, it is a bestseller, as you said in your
Yeah.
title.
Yeah.
Really.
We ready for Javier's criticisms?
No,
Okay, right.
I have many questions. I mean, you really raised many important issues and very innovative. So I have several short questions and broader questions.
Okay,
So
let me take a couple at a time, yeah.
Let's start with a short one regarding concerning authorship. I mean, the book seems to appear, at least the first edition, as an anonymous book, and at least that's
Except
what
for
I've
that,
seen.
yeah.
That's what is.
Yeah.
That's what I've seen for the censura,
Right.
censorship.
Well,
So,
no.
I mean, he said he tells us this is an anonymous book. The Carl Fisher, he's writing.
Yes, but let me explain why. Because he tells us in the beginning, in the first introduction, that he was in the home of a guy named Nathan Rees in Buchchatz, and he got sick, and he lost his eyesight, and he was... No, Hurwitz.
Hurwitz.
And he goes to another town, he goes to, I forgot where he goes, and he's cured. And he takes a vow, this is what he says, now this could be Norishkeit, I'm not sure it's true or not. He takes a vow that if I get my sight back, I will not I will not put my name on any book because I am a very humble man and so on. And while his friends tell him, he goes around and collects 7 rabbinic approbations and so on, the rabbis say, put your name on it, he doesn't. But as soon as the pirated edition comes out, in the next edition has his name right on the front. One other interesting detail about this, he says in the second introduction, well, people didn't know it was me. They thought it was either the Gaon Elijah of Vilna or Moses Mendelssohn. And of course he likes that. He likes the idea that either one of them could have been the author, but of course they weren't. But, and in fact, there's a historian in Vilna who says, who quotes this same line, and I think he likes Hurwitz because he's a combination of both. He's a good Eastern European Jew on the one hand, a good rabbinic type, but he's also Moses Mendelssohn in a certain sense. But that's the reason why the anonymity in the first volume.
No, I was asking that because in 1797 is the time the Napoleonic Wars are about to start. The revolution has already taken place. All the Shabbatian and Frankist movements are just going on through all Middle Europa
And especially Bruno.
Central Europa, yeah, in Britain. So I thought that he was really much afraid of the Orthodox establishment, especially all this Hungarian Orthodoxy that was organizing.
Right.
I don't know. That's why I was.
Right.
asking.
No, I mean,
So,
yeah. All right. Yeah, go on.
So to what extent is there any reflection of the Napoleonic Wars or French Revolution, Shabbatian movements and Frankist movement within the book? Is there any reference to that?
Okay. So nothing about Napoleon or about the French Revolution that I can remember. He refers many times to Shabbat Tzvi. Doesn't mention Frankists, but you can associate, some of his comments seem to be more or less contemporaneous, but he does give you he mentions Shabtai Tzvi in several places, talks about him and his early disciples, and says very negative things about them. What is interesting is that Hasidism is clearly around by the end of the 18th century, and he doesn't mention a word about Hasidism. And there is a text which my friend Yitzhak Malamed interprets. It talks about we should be very wary of new sects that call themselves pious, that appear on the scene, and so on. But he doesn't mention Hasidim. I think one of the reasons may be that whether he likes them or not, they are potential readers of his book, which they are. But Bruno indeed was a hotbed of Frankism by the time he published this book. I mean, if you read Pavel Macheko's book, Bruno is all over the place. So again, I did not get in the archives. Michael Miller looked a little bit for me in the archives of Bruno, but I didn't get there, and I wouldn't know what to do in that archive anyway. But I couldn't find anything more, nor could I find, these were two Christian printers who printed the book. And they had Jewish helpers. What is interesting he describes in great detail this whole incident, he said, you know, it's one thing, the Christians didn't know any better, but they had 3 Jewish proofreaders. They knew, I had 7 haskamot. I went and I got from the rabbi 7 approbations saying, you cannot republish this book without permission of the author for 15 years. They all say it so he wasn't just getting them because he wanted to make it kosher. He wanted them a kind of legal means of protecting him. And these 3 Jewish proofreaders ignored that, and they took out the Haskamot altogether in this next edition and just published it the way they wanted to publish it. And he says those Jews are sinners. They're horrible human beings. But I don't have anything about the Sabbatean context more than the fact that he talks about Shabtai Tzvi. But Shabtai Tzvi, of course, for traditional, this was another way of proclaiming how good a traditional Jew was. He was, because Shabtai Tzvi and the Frankists were the enemies. But nothing more explicit. There are several remarks about the extreme Haskalah. There are 2 maskilic figures, Satanov and Shaul Berlin, who he criticizes. And this is why Feiner argues it's an anti-Haskalah book. But, of course, as you know, the Haskalah, the Jewish Enlightenment, had many faces and many segments. The reason why he is upset by Satanov and Shaul Berlin. Now, Berlin's father was the rabbi of Berlin who invited Hurwitz to his house. So Berlin's father was not, he was a friend of his. Why was Shaul Berlin so controversial? Because both of them tried to publish their own works with rabbinic pseudonyms. They were creating these traditional books, which supposedly were traditional but had radical Enlightenment ideas in them. And what he found offensive was the fact that they were misrepresenting the Jewish tradition. That for him they were, so he does explode with regard to these 2 guys. But is this an anti-Haskalah book? Yes and no. I mean, I don't like these labels. That's what I don't want to. I won't label him a maskil. I won't label him a anti-maskil. I won't label him a chassid. I won't label him a traditionalist. I think he's all of these things. I mean, I think that's the rather than try to pigeonhole a specific ideology to this guy. I think he crosses, and I don't think he's an Eastern European Jew either. I think he's a transnational Jew who is westernized by his experience of going to the West. So for example, in my epilogue, I react to this new book by Eliyahu Stern. He's teaching at Yale, the book on the Gra, in which he argues for a certain cultural type. In Vilna, they were open. There was no beckoning bourgeoisie. In Mendelssohn was timid. In Berlin, but in Vilna they were open. Hurwitz sort of explodes that particular stereotype. I think it's too simplistic. We have, by the end of the 18th, 19th century, Jews are traveling. And by the way, Berlin, in many respects, was Eastern Europe for Jews in the end of the 18th century. Most of the Jews who come to Berlin are from Eastern Europe. I mean, they travel to Berlin. So is that West and is this East? And I think these categories get very confused. But anyway, I'm not answering. Go back to your questions.
Another question. Out of total ignorance and Freemasonry, besides Jacob Scott's study on Freemasonry and Jews in Germany, is there something else, for instance, for 18th century, this 18th century relationship? Because I mean, this is very interesting coming to Spain, when you see all these 18th century Hebraistes.
And some of them are Freemasons.
Some of them are Freemason, and not only that some of them have correspondence with Sephardic Jews, either in Bayonne, in Bordeaux, or in Amsterdam in the 18th century, starting in the 30s of the 18th century. And this is a subject that has not been studied.
Absolutely.
But I don't know what is happening, for instance, let's say in France, Italy at the same time, if there is some connection, or if there is some study.
Okay, I'm glad you mentioned that. Well, I mean, I refer you to the 10-15 pages of my book about the English Freemasons and the Jews. That's my Jewish Enlightenment book. My Jewish Enlightenment in English Key is the name of the book. But I think the key book that we need to be looking at, really to start this whole discussion, is Pavel Macheko's new book on Frankism.
That has been reviewed.
That has been reviewed in Sfarad. I think a very unfair review. I think it's a brilliant book. I published it, so I'm prejudiced. But what is going on? I don't know if any of you have heard of when Richard Popkin was alive, he attracted. Richard Popkin was this great historian of skepticism, philosopher, and so on. Dick attracted a whole group of young people who really found him charismatic and exciting, and they wrote in a whole variety of subjects. One of them is a woman named Marcia Schuchart. She must be pretty old by now. I don't know. I never actually met her. She was obsessed with theories of underground secret cults, secret movements. She wrote about the collusion of the Masons and the Frankists and the Sabbateans and the Swedenborgians and all of these groups. Another very important figure who has written on this is Martin Muslau in Erfurt. These are all people who are seeing all kinds of interesting connections between these radical Jewish Messianic groups and these groups of Freemasons and others, and various sects within the Freemasons. I mean, they're not one homogeneous group, and they are different in different countries. So I couldn't say a word about Italy or Freemasonry or Spanish Freemasonry, but Pavel has been looking at these. I think his next project, or maybe his third project, will be to explore these undercurrents. I mean, Schuchart, we used to look at her book, and she makes all kinds of ridiculous connections that, based on very circumstantial evidence. But now Pavel is actually showing that some of these are actually true. For example, we have a very interesting case. He's in my early modern book, I can't remember his name now, of a Sabbatean, an Eastern European Jew, who goes off to Sweden to study with Swedenborg, and to teach Swedenborg Hebrew, and to teach him Messianism. And he writes two texts. One of them has been studied by Elliot Wolfson and by one of the students of Judíos. One is a commentary on the Zohar, and the other is a commentary on the New Testament, both written in Hebrew. This is an Eastern European Jew, in which he argues, and this is my chapter on mingled identities, in that chapter on mingled identities, Kempfer, right. He argues that essentially to be a Jew you have to believe in Jesus Christ, and to be a Christian you have to observe the halakha, you have to observe Jewish law. And this is not, this is a combination of both, Jews and Christians and so on. He is part of this extraordinary underground that is going on. So I guess, overtones of the Inquisition come into this as well. But the 18th century is a world filled with these radical messianic groups, Christians, Jews. There are all kinds of undergrounds going on here, which I think have to be explored. The problem of exploring them, of course, is that they're hidden. They don't reveal their text, and they're not so easy. But what Pavel has already shown in terms of the Frankists is unbelievable connections with a whole group of Enlightenment figures. This is mostly in Eastern Europe and Central Europe. But I think this could be expanded. So I think this is certainly an agenda for future study. I tried to organize a number of years ago with Martin and with Pavel and a few others, a whole conference on heterodoxy. We did a short version of this this year in Budapest, but we didn't have the right people there who really work on this stuff, you know, and it should include, you know, the kind of people that are working, you know, on your project and you know, and the kinds of things that we're exploring in terms of, you know, Jews, Christians, Muslims, and all of their various connections. But there's really an awful lot going on here, and therefore I think Freemasonry is a subject that has not been fully explored at all. I think there's much more to it. I mean, Katz, with all of his precocious understanding of the world, I mean, to write about this subject, you know, way back in the 70s, 1960s, and so on, was absolutely brilliant. But of course, his story is a story of how it collapsed. It was, you know, open, and he saw it also in terms of what he called the semi-neutral society preceding emancipation and enlightenment. It was, you know, he included in this group Hofjuden, you know, who were exceptional Jews who could move around the space of Europe, and Freemasons were another, and so on. But I think in its own right, we're speaking about some really interesting things here. And certainly a large part of the story are how Frankist and Sabbatian ideas. Why Frankist and Sabbatian ideas? Because, remember, Shabtai Tzvi converted to Islam. And remember that Jacob Frank converted to Christianity. So we're saying that to be a Jew, you must become either a Muslim or a Christian in the end. In other words, these movements themselves created this mingled identity, created this fusion, which thus creates this kind of crazy response on the part of Christians, Jews, and so on. And then on the other hand, you have all these Christian Hebraists who are discovering Judaism and are working out their own Christian identity with this knowledge. And of course, some of it is Kabbalistic as well. So we have here, you know, wonderful worlds to explore for the cultural historian.
Okay.
Anything more?
Next one, yeah, some more, but tonight someone has a question.
Anybody else want to ask besides Javier? Take a break from Javier? I don't want to take a break from him, but I will.
Another one.
Go on, go on.
No.
Go on.
Okay.
You have something, right? No? No. Okay, all right, go on. All right, go on.
Susanna,
No, sorry.
she's a scientist.
And
okay.
Kabbalist also.
Scientist and Kabbalist, wow.
Yeah, she's very
No, I'm not a
interesting.
Kabbalist. I study Kabbalah. It's different.
All right, okay. I'm not a Kabbalist either, yeah.
Okay, a more methodological one. When you are talking about moral cosmopolitanism, and I'm thinking of our seminar. A year ago, Rigel was talking about Shevet Yehuda. This seems to be the beginning of moral cosmopolitanism, or is this too early, or we can make another label for Ibn Berga, because he was living in different worlds also, in different countries.
Right.
He was a transnational
Right.
Jew. He converted at
Right.
some point.
Right.
So would you see him within the same framework of moral
Yeah, I mean,
cosmopolitanism?
you know, there you have the famous story in the Shevet Yehuda of the, you know, the father who has the one jewel, and there are 3 children, and so it's each one of them thinks they have it, but they're, you know, and this has been, Yossi Schwartz wrote a wonderful article on that as well, and traced that whole theme, which actually begins in Boccaccio, so you can go all the way back to, you know, to the Middle Ages. I mean, these themes are there, and certainly, I'm thinking also of another, who was this guy that wrote this, he was a New York rabbi who wrote, he writes on the Talmud, and then he wrote this book about Sephardic Judaism, in which he talks about Sephardim being the only humanitarians, you know, unlike the, I mean, it's a, yeah, Faor. And he has a long chapter on the Shevet Yehuda in that book as well, in which he makes,
in Madrid.
what?
He studied in Madrid.
He studied in Madrid, right. And Faor makes the argument, I mean, you know, he's a very chauvinistic Sephardic Jew too. I mean, he says, you know, the Ashkenazim don't, they're not humanitarian, they're not the humanists like we are, you know, the Sephardim. And for him, therefore, Shevet Yehuda is a major text of this kind. Yeah, I mean, I think these themes are there. I think Hurwitz text certainly could fit in there, but I think, of course, the difference is that now he's really making it a moral commandment to love. He brings in the Leviticus text, and he specifically argues, loving humanity. It's implied, maybe in Shevet Yehuda in some form or shape, or at least that everyone has an equal path to the truth, and that on some level we should get over, anti-Semitism and chauvinism and so on and so forth. But I think, there's a long way to travel from Shevet Yehuda to Hurwitz in the 18th century. I also haven't gone through, and I actually do it in a very long chapter of the book, in which I explore the beginnings of attitudes towards the non-Jew in early modern Europe. And there are. Jacob Katz himself, in a book called Exclusiveness and Tolerance, which is a very important text, although the final conclusions of the book are problematic, he does trace the beginning of a more tolerant approach towards Christianity on the part of a whole group of early modern rabbis, bringing us right through 16th, 17th, 18th century, and so on. And then you have a character, for example, here's another interesting character that actually Pavel is writing a book on right now, Yonatan Eibeshitz. In the 18th century, Eibeshitz got into a major controversy with Jacob Emden. Emden accused him of being a Sabbatean, a follower of Shabtai Tzvi. And Eibeshitz was accused specifically of having an amulet where on one side was the Magen David and the other side was a cross. So his crime was really mingle identity. And then his son converted to Christianity. So you have here a rabbi who was very traditional, wrote halacha, was appreciated, but nevertheless has this background of being a Sabbatean. He also addressed the issue of loving Goyim. And Pavel gave me a homily that he wrote, and also one of his disciples who became a Christian writes about this as well. He argues that Jews have to love Christians. So it's there. I mean, the difference is that Eibeshitz was considered a heretic, that this text was hidden. This text obviously entered the public sphere and was read by all kinds of Jews, and no one was bothered by it too much. I don't have many. There are one or two objections to this text, to this specific Ahavat Re'im. But as you pointed out, or we should underscore again, in 1842, the text Ahavat Re'im, the chapter on loving neighbors, was published as a separate text. In other words, this guy, the publisher was flagging it. I mean, these are these great Ladino, Ottoman Jews. Let's love Goyim. And forget about the rest of the book. I just want to publish this one chapter.
And he also answers Javier's question, because he puts not only this, he's not inspired just by Sefer ha-Brit, but by also by Shevet Yehuda and another work.
Yeah, that's right. He put Shevet Yehuda together.
So you
exactly.
have it there.
Beautiful,
so that
beautiful.
is beautiful,
yeah, exactly.
really.
That's really interesting. So the Ladino mind
Yeah.
has linked these two worlds together.
Mm-hmm.
You know, you're absolutely right. For those of you that don't know what Shevet Yehuda is, it's an amazing text. We finally are going to have an English translation of it. Yosef Yerushalmi, before he died, prepared an English translation, but never finished the footnotes and never published it. I actually signed the contract. I was the head of the El Judaica series at the time, and we never got it from him. But Yerushalmi's widow has given it to Jeremy Cohn, and Jeremy Cohn has been working for a long time on a new edition of this 16th century Spanish text, which is an extraordinary text for the study of Jewish-Christian relations in the 16th century, and is way ahead of its time in many respects, and needs to be studied both within the context of Spain and after Spain. One more footnote about the Shevet Yehuda in relationship to the later readers of the 18th century. Michael Stanislavski published a wonderful article on the Yiddish versions of the Shevet Yehuda. I don't know if you ever saw that article. In which they take out all of the Spanish stuff, but they leave the morality and the ethics. It's very interesting what they do with the text. So it would be very interesting to compare the Ladino versions of Shevet Yehuda with the Yiddish versions, and how this book also became a kind of bestseller. It was also translated, if I'm not mistaken, into Latin and read by Christians as well. I may be wrong about that, but I think I'm right. Christians certainly quote the Shevet Yehuda all the time.
There is a student who is finishing her PhD now on the Ladino versions of the Shevet.
Of Shevet Yehuda.
Mm-hmm.
Wonderful. All right, so we will have it. Okay, great. Go on.
I have two quick questions. In terms of the moral cosmopolitanism and the injunction to love all humanity, you mentioned the exceptions, and you sort of brushed over them. Who are the exceptions? Because, as far as I can tell, universalism always has its, or universal humanity always has its non-humans that it requires, right? So who are the exceptions in his
Okay, you can see it here.
his universal
The
humanity?
two exceptions are the children of Seth, explicitly without exception. Either a nation or an individual are included in the commandment to love. No human being was created only for himself. Wait. Oh, did I leave that part out? Wait, I'm looking for it. It's not there? No, I think, wait. There are two exceptions by the notion of love. The first is the savage called a wildeman. The latter have no houses and no special places. They never plow nor plant, but only eat fruit and walk around naked, and all the women are licentious. The Spaniard. No. They live like the beasts of the earth, like flocks that have no shepherd with respect to their life. He's talking about the Africans, about the New World, right? And the second are those who are the murderers, the thieves, the bandits, and the like. Now, the reason I didn't emphasize this, it seems to me, when you look at Enlightenment treatises on morality, they also have exceptions, right? Atheists are always exceptions, you know.
Yeah, that was
So here are the two exceptions that he mentions. Rezien Fontaine, who is a scholar in Amsterdam, who has written on this chapter as well, makes a big deal about the exceptions. She thinks that ultimately, maybe I should mention it. He never explicitly, I mean, he's talking about all of humanity, but as you get more and more into the chapter, he seems to be talking more about the Jewish community and about its deficiencies. Particularly that one long section where he criticizes, and it looks like an Amsterdam scene. He spent time in Amsterdam. The Ashkenazim and the Sephardim treat each other like dirt, in Amsterdam in the 18th century. And he's very upset by that. He says, why can't we, work our issues out? So there seems to be a shift from the universal to the particular, which to me could be interpreted that really what this chapter is all about is a very strong critique of Jewish chauvinism and particularism. One of my students read this text and said, this is a good text for the 21st century for certain Jews that we won't mention. As you know, all history is Javier won't admit it, but all history is autobiography. Everything we do historical is about ourselves. He's a pure historian. I'm not. But I mean, the reason I got into this book had to do with this chapter. Jews need to read this chapter. I'd love to teach it in synagogues.
Why? Can you say why?
Why?
I mean,
why the exceptions?
No. Why did Jews need to read this chapter?
Because it's universalism. It's cosmopolitanism. When we were listening to Michael Paley so he mentions, he was describing, this was a group of Jewish students from Paideia who came down to have a conference in Toledo, which Carmen organized. And what they were doing in Toledo and what, I don't know, but anyway, they made Carmen work very hard. And the rabbi there gave a talk on which he described, it was sort of like, I hate these talks, rabbis, here's the essence of Judaism in 5 words, But he argued essentially that Jews are very intellectual, and I argued with him and said, well, yeah, they used to be intellectual, but now it's the Chinese, the Indians, and everybody else that have sort of replaced them. Second of all, they're cosmopolitan, he said. I guess there are some cosmopolitan Jews still around. I mean, there was Marx and there was, others, but the Jews I know are pretty parochial and chauvinistic. And then the third point was that they enjoy wealth. And I said, oh my God, yeah, I guess so, yeah. But they give charity. That was the final point, tzedakah. But he was arguing, certainly, the whole myth of the cosmopolitan Jew and so on, both the negative connotations and the positive. But I mean, why do I find this attractive? Why does Hurwitz find it attractive? What was your question again?
Either one you want to answer.
Well, I mean, I find it attractive because I'm a liberal who who does in fact enjoy. I don't know if we can love everyone, but I certainly appreciate a traditional text which is a remarkable statement about the other. I think not only Jews. I mean, I don't want to sound like a self-hating Jew here. Not only Jews, but a lot of us have become very nationalistic, very chauvinistic, very afraid of the other in all kinds of respects. We live in a world of extraordinary heated passions, and this kind of text is a good text. I'll tell you a personal story. I'm sure some of you will be embarrassed, but this is my American style of teaching. I have one daughter who is married to a rabbi, and I have a second son who just married a Hindu. It took me. I had difficulty with it because I'm also a Reform rabbi, a liberal rabbi, and I've never performed a marriage of someone outside the Jewish faith. But I had to, what am I going to do? Disown my son? He's my son. And then I got to know the Hindu family, and they were really very special. And indeed, they share the values that Michael Paley was talking about. They're extremely intellectual. Every one of them are doctors. They're cosmopolitan. They work hard. They give charity. They're extraordinarily generous, and so on. But what I did, so I decided I was going to do a Jewish ceremony. We had a Hindu ceremony and a Jewish ceremony. And I wrote a sermon, which was basically a sermon to get off my chest how I was feeling about this, my own ambivalence. And so what I did was I have a friend in Israel who was one of the great scholars of Hinduism in the world, David Schulman. I don't know, you know David Schulman? Yeah. And I said, so I spent time with him. I said, I need you as my Rebbe, help me. So he spent several hours with me talking about that Hinduism is not idolatry, and that's a good religion, and and that they love the family, and that they have all these good moral values, and I really felt good. And then he gave me several of his books of translating. He's a specialist on southern India, and he translated all of these wonderful Hindu hymns. So I found a hymn, a Hindu hymn, which I juxtaposed against Ahavat Re'im. I took this text, and that was the homily. If you want it, I'll send you a copy of my sermon. In case you marry a Hindu, you may use it. It was so why am I interested in the text? Obviously, I have a personal interest in. So I took Hurwitz made it into my rabbinic homily. So I don't always separate my own personal world from my academic work, even though hopefully this is an academic project, not a personal project. But clearly, I mean, every one of the projects that all of you work on has something to do with who you are as a person, and that goes without saying. Yeah.
I don't know, just to make you feel, I don't know, that the Kabbalah said that the Hindus are actually the children of Abraham, the ones that he gave gifts to his wives and sent to the east. So that made you feel better.
And of course, there are lots of references to Hodim and Maimonides and so on. There was a whole Indian medieval philosophy that enters into the Jewish and the Islamic world, I would assume, as well. So these things are all very much connected. So anyway, I mean, this text is really interesting. But what I expected to find, honestly, was extraordinary opposition to this. The text could have been controversial. And yet, among the most traditional circles, including the Moses Sefer, Chatam Sofer, the arch-Orthodox, they ignore it, or they don't talk about it, but they're not offended by it. And as you saw, are the most universal Jews of all, the Ladino Jews, they embrace it. They think it's fantastic. It is a voice from the Jewish past that needs to be reclaimed in the Jewish present, I guess, is what I'm saying. Yes.
Right now, in modernity, how many people, mostly among the Orthodox Jews, are they reading this book?
I don't know. I mean, it's still sold. It's still in print. And I found it in the chat line, as I said. It's an obscure text, but I could give you so many other testimonies. Isaac Bashevis Singer, the great Yiddish writer who won a Nobel Prize. Did he win a Nobel?
Yeah, of course.
So he mentions, this was one of his favorite books, and he mentions that it was the favorite book of his mother.
Wow.
Well, the other thing I talk about was the gendered reception of this book. What's her name? Rachel Morpurgo, this great poetess of the end of the 18th century, who, there's a woman at Bar Ilan who's writing a biography of her, Cohn her name is. She's enchanted by this book, and she sees it. I mean, what emerges in the Haskalah period are a whole, reading, as we've learned from recent scholarship, was very gendered, so that essentially while the boys were off studying in yeshivot and had a very narrow understanding of the world, women were reading in French and German and so on, and were mastering libraries out there and so on. But apparently this was a book that was read by women as well, and appreciated this book. And Rachel Morpurgo talks about it as a kind of spiritual guide of her life. But Isaac Bashevis Singer's mother refers to this book as her favorite book, which he would quote. So we have this, it's sort of embedded within traditional libraries at the turn of the century. Now, is it read today in, turn of the 20th century? So is it read today? I don't know. It may have gone out of fashion to some extent. But there is clearly a history. And then the other aspect that I mentioned, I don't want to keep repeating myself, was that among Sephardic Jews, this has a history. Because there are a whole group of Sephardic rabbis who read the Kabbalah and appreciated it, and were far from the intellectual centers of European culture. Mm-hmm. So for them, this was a vehicle of Sephardic Jewish education. And we have this in the yeshivot of Jerusalem, for example. The Sefer ha-Brit is quoted by a whole group of rabbis. In Iraq, in Iran, I have a whole group of, a long list in my book of rabbis that read this, and again, read it for all kinds of crazy reasons. I mean, it's not the obvious chapters of the book that I was interested in. I closed my book by saying, look, I was interested in the Kant stuff. I was interested in Ahavat Re'im. I was interested in the science. But to the readers of Sefer ha-Brit, I don't think they would be reading the same thing that I'm reading, or looking at it the same way as this as being the most outstanding part. And then I quote a long section of him preparing himself by washing, by putting on white clothes, by cleaning his thoughts, and preparing for spiritual meditation. That probably is what people found attractive in this book, at the end of the book. But look what precedes it, of course, which makes it interesting.
Thanks for your other words. My question is more formal. Which are the difference or the similars between the narration of the travel, the mystic travel, with the original Merkabah literature?
What does his Kabbalah have to do with earlier Kabbalah, is what you're asking?
Yes, the description of the journey.
Right. All right, well, I can't give you a totally authoritative answer to this. I mean, I acknowledge that I'm not an historian of the Kabbalah. All I can say is that what really attracted him, and what he knows really well, is the Kabbalah of Isaac Luria. In other words, that clearly is all over the place, beginning with Vital and his commentary, and quoting Vital all over the place, but also quoting long sections of Luria, and the Sefer HaZohar, and the interpreters of Lurianic Kabbalah in Italy in the 17th, 18th century. So Chayriki, Ramchal, there are several more. I'm blocking out the other important rabbi in 18th century Italy and so on. So there are very few references. You have a safe journey.
Thank you.
And
Thank you for your lecture.
okay.
It helped a lot.
Okay, great.
Okay, bye.
But I mean, I can't, what I have not done is to study in great depth all of his Kabbalistic sources. But I think the general picture I've given you, that Lurianic Kabbalah made a splash, it entered this realm of popular literature. It became accessible. We have now a Kabbalah scholar in Jerusalem called Yonatan Garb, who is writing now a book on the Ramchal, on Rabbi Moses Chaim Lutzato. But there are a whole group of young scholars, since Gershon Sholem has died, who are working on modern Kabbalah. That is, right up to Madonna and, what's going on in California and so on. you know, Kabbalah centers and all of that. Is that, you're working on that too? No. No.
I started with them, but
Ah,
no,
you started
I'm
with them,
finished.
all right.
I'm finished with them. No.
Boaz Hus, I don't know if you know Boaz Hus and some of these people. So what's interesting about this book is that it's part of their cultural. Here's how the Kabbalah enters a more popular public space. You don't have to be a Kabbalist to read this work, but nevertheless there are long sections that he quotes the Kabbalah and so on. So you know, all of the sources I don't have. Does he know early Kabbalah? Merkavai doesn't quote. He quotes the Sefer Zohar primarily, which of course has it is really an early modern book, even though it was written in the 13th century, it was published. So now we're quoting from published editions that appeared for the first time in the 16th century. And he quotes primarily Lurianic Kabbalah. So that's really where you would look.
Yeah, I would like to close here